Hello, everyone. I am the White Angel, and I am a conservative. Today's video, or rather this video, I should say, since I did one earlier, this will be a quick overview on the pillars of Western civilization concept. This is the founding principles of Western civilization. There are currently 3. Arguably, there should be a few more. Oh, pardon, no, 4. There are currently 4. There should arguably be a few more. There should be possibly a 5th or a 6th, or maybe only 5. Maybe 1 or 2 of the ones that are currently there should honestly be removed. But that's a discussion for another time. We will educate now on a brief overview of the pillars of Western civilization, which are in order of appearance and when they occurred in history. Order number 1, Greek philosophy. The purpose of philosophy is to advance human understanding by altering or changing one's perspective, looking at things from a different angle when the previous angle no longer serves. This can lead to mindsets which are very dangerous and at times even immoral. So it is best when changing one's mindset to be careful what territory you're really crossing into. But if you look at something from multiple angles, the meaning of that something really can change pretty wildly. It's actually really amazing how the human brain works. Philosophy is incredible. You should totally study it. The second pillar of Western civilization is Roman law. Every culture has a cultural obsession. The ancient Hebrews had a culture with cultural obsession that is with foreskins, very creepy and disgusting. And the Romans had a cultural obsession with law and order. They were very into law and order, to the point where law and order trumped common morality. Now, obviously, the Romans took that concept way, way too far. But it's necessary to have laws. And it's important to realize that rather than laws dictating morals, morals should dictate laws. It's the other way around. The purpose of law is to protect the good moral citizens from those who do not share their morals and would molest them. The reason why it is illegal to rape is to protect people from it, and so on and so forth. Roman law is the basis for the most common law, for British common law, for American law. It's all roughly based on Roman law. So that's important to account. The Romans even had a kind of police force. They were both cops and soldiers at the same time. So, fun fact about that. And of course, when the Romans conquered the parts of the world, they advanced the world through technology and reason and so forth. The third pillar of Western civilization is the pillar which is my least favorite, but we do have to acknowledge it, is Christianity. Judeo-Christian values, particularly from the Enlightenment period, did a lot to create our modern world. The rights of the child is Enlightenment period. The emphasis on compassionate, neighbor-loving behavior is Enlightenment period. Enlightenment period art informs a lot of the visual art styles of Western civilization, and some of that stuff, it is so fucking beautiful, man. Like, you could have arguments for days on, like, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, what's his face, Van Gogh. I love Van Gogh. Van Gogh's beautiful, man. Starry Night, hell yeah. Love Van Gogh. And then finally, with the Enlightenment bringing higher morals and a higher standard of living, it was both a dark time and a beautiful time, all at once. It's truly incredible thinking about the Enlightenment and all the darkness. In order to understand the moral high road, you really do kind of have to take the low road first, just to see how bad gets. That was the Middle Ages, the medieval period, and the Enlightenment was the period that followed. Sort of fixing the dystopia that was the Middle Ages. Like, I'm not even kidding. Christians burning each other alive over theological disputes, rampant disease, harsh punishments. The Middle Ages was horrible. And the Enlightenment was sort of, which is really is sort of the pillar that makes the Judeo-Christian value, but is really more the Enlightenment more than anything else. And then finally, the fourth pillar is modern science. The ability to examine the physical world, to reason, to understand things as they are, rather than simply going off what they appear to be. The ability to analyze and be critical, and the use of critical thought. Which, in spite of it being so important to Western civilization, critical thought, most people these days, their critical thought skills are extremely underdeveloped. It's actually very disturbing. By Western standards, my critical thought abilities are very developed. You know, I'm practically a giant compared to some people. But if I were to go to some place like Japan, or Sweden, or even China, where education standards are really, really high, I would look plebeian by comparison. Oh yeah. I'm a genius here, but elsewhere I'm a fucking idiot. So, so there's a painful admission for you there, because humility is truly a higher value than pride. Fuck pride. Be humble. You know, because you're a fragile, weak, mortal human being, and at any point in time, the earth itself could open up and swallow you whole. You could drown in the ocean, get struck by a bolt of lightning. You could even catch fire, supposedly, if you're familiar with the theory of spontaneous human combustion. There's all kinds of ways I could just suddenly die right now. The chances are never zero, and yet here I am. Still alive, still kicking. So it behooves me, therefore, to humbly realize that I am not a ruler of the earth, nor is any human being. We are another fragile mortal creature on its surface which could be broken to 1,000 pieces at any second. Don't spend too much time thinking about that, but just realize that you ain't hot shit like you think you are. Okay? You ain't hot shit. You're nothing. You're a ugly sack of mostly water. A mostly hairless cave ape. So you have to understand, of course, that these pillars are the foundation of modern human civilization in the Western Hemisphere. This is what we are built upon, and this is what we need to preserve first and foremost. This is the basis. This is Western Civilization 101. And we need to develop our critical thought skills to a higher level than what they currently are. Because right now they're too weak. They're much too weak. That being said, I definitely think it's time to discuss in detail what I will be doing as a video series discussing in greater detail each pillar in order, and maybe discussing how a few more should be added to that basis. At least one, maybe two, that are considerably more foundational than certain others. And they'll be somewhat controversial because they are from the pre-Christian period, but they are foundational. Because much of our modern-day iconography, like the Statue of Liberty and other things, will actually come from the pre-Christian period. So it, too, is extremely important to acknowledge. We can't just go one and the other. We have to do both. Or we're doing the entire civilization a complete and utter disservice. That is, of course, going to piss off Christians, because we are going to be talking about some unfortunate histories that, you know, is not going to make them feel very good. They're going to feel some Christian guilt. But, you know, there's ways you can deal with that. The best response to guilt possible really is self-love. It's important to acknowledge that the crimes of the past, you were not responsible, you were not there, you did not do that. But it is at the same time is to acknowledge that because you have the same beliefs as those forebears, the right amount of peer pressure could potentially make you feel like doing what they did, or repeating similar crimes. History repeats itself. That's why we can never afford to forget it. That's why the Nazi work camps, like Auschwitz, where people were worked to death, or just taken out and shot in some cases, where millions and millions of people were slaughtered wholesale. That's why they still exist as museums, because we cannot ever forget. We must never forget. And yes, I know there are Holocaust deniers in the world, and they're fucking assholes. And if I weren't such a highfalutin moral person, I would be sorely tempted to either choke them out, punch them in the face, or do something to them. I wouldn't kill them, but I'd certainly want to make them suffer a little. Sick people, man. This is sick people, and this is a sick world. But, yeah, there you go. Those are the pillars in detail. The importance of Greek philosophy, Roman law, Enlightenment, Judeo-Christian values, and... There's a fly in front of my face, a little maggot. I got a fly problem in here. And modern science. We'll be discussing those in detail, and when I get to the modern science pillar, we are going to have a serious talk about critical thought skills. And I will brush up on my own to develop them just a little bit more. For each video in that series, I will gladly do a little research, but that is roughly the overview. And here's the relationship between the pillars themselves. You see, Democritus was pointing heavily in the direction of science. He created the idea of first stuff, that is, the origin of the universe. He postulated it as being empty space and atoms. That is to say, these smaller and smaller objects. Yes, he postulated atoms before they were isolated in a lab. He developed them as a hypothesis, and then future generations came along after the Middle Ages, took the idea, and finally proved that his atoms were in fact real. The man was clearly way ahead of his time. He was absolutely brilliant. The smartest Greek philosophers, without any doubt, were Democritus, Aristotle, and Plato was kind of more of a statesman than a true philosopher. That does not make him in any way less valuable than the others. He created the republican system, which was his substitute for democracy, which still allowed for the advantages of democracy, while also had special rules preventing the failings of democracy, which were voter influence and mob rule. He identified straight as direct democracy as the tyranny of the many, which is indeed a horrible, horrible situation, which is why the republican system was invented. So that makes Plato's legacy absolutely incredible. So what if he wasn't as intelligent or as brilliant as some of the others? His importance cannot be understated to the modern world. Not even. There's no way you can understate that shit. And he informed so much of his fellows, the big three of Greek philosophy being Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Socrates didn't really write much of his work down, so some of it is really related to us through scribes and scholars who studied with him. And these three people ultimately informed Alexander the Great, who was further inspired by Christian scripture to conquer and modernize much of the Western world, creating much of our modern tradition, making way for the modern world. It is sad to admit, but it is true that much of Western civilization is built on Alexandrian conquest, and to some extent Napoleonic conquest, which is a painful admission. There is a lot of blood and a lot of pain in history. We can take advantage of Alexander's successes while condemning the horrors of war. You need to understand that Alexander was a civilized man, and he had rules and ethics for war. He tried to make war a thing that was not quite so painful as it could have been. Was it wrong of him? Was it a sense of entitlement to conquer nations and bring them under his foot? Yes. But was he wrong to then bring those conquered nations up to a modern standard by giving them things like education and philosophy and art? Absolutely not. That's the bit that was right. That's the good bit. You know, and there are arguably peaceful means by which those kinds of things can be offered. You know, they don't have to be brought up violently. But keep in mind that our morals today, or some of us anyway, our supposed morals are supposed to be superior to then. That is, of course, a discussion for another time. That is a debate in of itself. But needless to say, they informed Alexander the Great. They were his teachers. They were his fathers. They were his lovers. And if it was not for him, much of our modern world could not exist, any more than it would be for Plato, Socrates, or Aristotle. And it was guys like Democritus and Plato and Platonism that really kind of informed Neoplatonism, which later formed the pillar of modern science. Roman law is largely unrelated to Greek philosophy, but the Romans were great cultural mimics. They were essentially the second coming of ancient Greece. A sister civilization, rather. A further variation on the same idea, and much of their laws were based on the laws of the more enlightened Greek city-states. The problem with Greece is that at the time is that it was very unstable. There were many, many city-states and many, many places, differing opinions. There was Sparta, there was Athens, etc. Those various cities. It's kind of like what we going on now with Seattle and Portland versus some other places. It's kind of starting to look a little bit like the Greek city-state situation. So if you want an idea of what it looked like, think about Portland being at odds with the rest of Oregon, or Seattle being sort of a blight on the skin of Washington. And, you know, you sort of get some idea of the ideological separation. Somewhat, being at odds with the rest of the thing. But Roman law was based on some of the more enlightened city-states. Now, I'm not too familiar, I'm not up on my Roman law. I know quite a bit about Greek philosophy and somewhat about modern science and Enlightenment values. I have to admit, I have not been familiarized myself much with Roman law. But the basics are, is they had what they called a codex, which was a law book. Each civilization the Romans conquered and brought into the empire were given a specific codex that preserved their tribal law. There was a Greek codex, a Jewish codex, a Germanic codex. I actually know the name of that one. That's called Ordeus Barbarum, or Order of the Barbarians, which was sort of a derogatory term for Germanic peoples, because they did not care for each other. You know, they were socially and ideologically opposed on many points. And the situation between the Germans and the Romans is not totally unlike United States and Mexico. Hell, the Romans even built a border wall. So, yeah. So, yeah, writing it down on paper form, the Romans took the oral traditions of Western civilization and wrote them down and put them on paper. Many of the ancient mythologies were also given the same treatment. The beliefs of the Germans, of the Old Norse, the Greeks were all updated, modernized, and written down in written form. Because the problem with oral tradition is you have what they call the game of telephone. So if you speak the law rather than write it down, the law will eventually be corrupted by perspective. It is not properly preserved. You know, so oral history is not really the best way to preserve history and mythology, and is certainly not the best for law. So the Romans were absolutely right about that, to write it down in codexes. So that's important to acknowledge. Even the Statue of Liberty is a symbol of America. The book she holds is a codex. So that's symbolizing the codex of American law, you could say. Now, moving on to Enlightenment Christian values is a quick overview of that. Christianity initially in the West was pretty friggin' awful. Harsh punishments, harsh law, fundamentalism. It's because Orthodox Christianity was the version that won out, Western Orthodox, and it was pretty savage and pretty brutal, which later became the Catholic Church, which today is mired in controversy. But when the Enlightenment came around as a response to the Middle Ages, things started to look pretty nice in the Enlightenment. People were waking up and beginning to realize, my God, that was horrible. What were we doing? What were we thinking? Sort of the Victorian age was still quite harsh, but it was much nicer than the Middle Ages, thanks be to the Enlightenment. You had a renewed interest in philosophy and education, the beginnings of early modern science, which they called natural philosophy, beautiful, gorgeous art, new morals, the rights of the child, compassionate behavior, manners and etiquette, treatment for disease, like you name it, man. It just things got so much better so quickly. within a relatively short period. You know, if you look at civilization itself in history, a few hundred years is a relatively short time. That is like the length of a breath in the span of history. The Earth is more than 6,000 years old. It is millions of years old. And human civilization, much of it is untraceable, but it's more than 10,000 years. So a few hundred, that's like a breath or a sneeze. So that's relatively quick. Then you had the Industrial Revolutions coming after that. You had all sorts of stuff. Then finally, the pillar of modern science. The quick overview being that modern science came out of natural philosophy, which was a philosophical study of nature by changing your perspective on nature, by observing natural phenomenon within its own accord, and testing it. Testing their observations. People like Sir Isaac Newton, Sir Francis Bacon, and several others. Yes, they were English. They were knighted. The institution of being a knight was pretty different after the Enlightenment. You were less of a sword-wielding hero and more of like a kind of a societal role model, someone to look up to, you know? That's what knighthood is today, is knights and ladies are basically, they're role models for the English. And some here in the United States see them as role models to some extent. You know, people of great character. And many of them are, knighted sirs. You know, they're worthy of that sort of thing. Although they maybe should raise the standard just a bit. Just a bit, if they want to. But anyway, Francis Bacon created a basic Baconian scientific method which more or less spoke on testing results of an observation by identifying a cause, then repeating that cause, and seeing if you get the exact same result and recording it down. And Isaac Newton, he invented a new kind of math called calculus because he wanted to know at what distance and at what speed the moon arrived into orbit around the Earth. After we finally realized that, the objects do not revolve around the Earth, rather the Earth revolves around the sun. Once we get that heliocentric model of the solar system, he's then trying to figure out, from how far away did the moon arrive, and from, at what speed? And no form of mathematics available at the time was sufficient to calculate that, so he created calculus. The mind that could create an entirely new form of math just to solve one stinking problem. My fucking God, that is genius. It is so sad that the dude literally ended up going crazy, you know? His family hit him up in the cellar because he went insane. It was up in the attic, pardon. Doing weird things up there. You know, it is really sad that there is a defining line between genius and madness. And that line is very thin. There's not much room. Like, you're usually on one side or the other, but if you're genius, you're on the line, and you're almost kind of insane already. You know what I'm saying? You geniuses out there, you need to be grounded, man, otherwise you're going to go nuts. And we need less crazy people, not more. So suffice to say, modern science sort of came about because of these sorts of things. Of methods and experiments and testing, and all just sort of coalesce from multiple sources. And people like James Faraday, inventor of the Faraday cage, trapping electrons while still making them usable, but protected from the outside. So it would be a great defense against what they call a pinch, which is a device that can emit an electromagnetic pulse. And that was in, I think, the 1800s, I think? I'll have to look up James Faraday again. But I was quite up on my science history once upon a time. It's been a while. So yeah, those are the current extant pillars of Western civilization. This was an overview, and it's going to be important to have this knowledge to create a reformed, conservative platform to take us into the future and preserve the spirit of Western civilization. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Reformation.